Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Professor Qamari Tabrizi, for the generous invite, and thank you all for joining us. It's nice to see both new and familiar faces here today. So as is usual with these things, this paper I'm presenting today is a section of a larger project. So there'll be some leaps that'll be made throughout the paper. So bear with me and hopefully I can fill in the blanks.
Closer.
Sorry.
Before people protest.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the image that's up on the screen right now, as well as on the poster for this event. So in a striking photograph taken and captioned by Nasser-ud-Din Shah, the Qajar monarch who ruled over Iran between 1848 and 1896, a large gathering of his high-ranking court and harem servants fills the steps leading up to the ostentatious doorway of the Shah's bedchambers, his khapgah, located at the heart of his harem. The image, likely taken in 1887, at the dawn of the last decade of his rule, is of a small cross-section of the multiracial laboring class who lived and worked in the Shah's residence at Gulistan Palace, and who, in my larger project, I argue were a significant part of the Qajar royal family structure. The maintenance and day-to-day function of the Gulistan court and its harem relied on this complex labor force made up of women, men, eunuchs, who make up the primary demographic in this photograph, and children, many of whom were brought in as slaves, linking the center of Qajar power in Tehran to geographies of Iran's slave trade in the northern and southern regions of the country. The demographic diversity visible here, which also shaped the broader demographic, racial, and ethnic diversity of Tehran during this period, was in large part the result of a long-standing and multi-directional slave trade from neighboring regions of the dynasty and its porous imperial frontiers. The laboring class of Gulistan during this period included a significant number of Caucasian and Kurdish people from Georgia, Armenia, Circassia, and the various Kurdish tribal regions who had entered Iran from the northwest, a small number of Turkic people from northern and northeast Central Asia, as well as an increasing number of East Africans who originated from places like Ethiopia, Nubia, Tanzania, and Zanzibar, and entered primarily through the Gulf trade in the south. This diverse population of enslaved people was often reduced to being categorized and labeled as Black or white slaves, racial categories that increasingly circulate during the same time period. They don't originate in this period, but they circulate more widely. These individuals are amongst the most liminal figures of the Qajar court, slave servants who occupied central positions in the Shah's harem and were able to move between the gender-segregated interior and exterior sections of the palace with access to its deeply private realms, as well as highest-ranked administrative offices. They were often in charge of granting or refusing access to others who moved between the two realms. The setting here, on the front steps of this most exclusive building within the Andarun of the Gulistan Palace, the Shah's bedchamber, affirms their position as both servant custodians and intermediaries. At the front and center of this composition sits a young Malijak, the nephew of one of the Shah's favorite concubines, or Sighez, Amin Abbas, who herself entered Gulistan as a young enslaved girl from Kurdistan in 1859, and by the time of this photo had risen to great prominence in Nasser-ud-Din Shah's harem. Her nephew Malijak, the son of one of the Shah's footmen, is seated in the front row and nestled between the legs of an African eunuch whose large figure both frames and offers protection to the young boy. In Qajar historiography, Malijak is well known as the object of an unusual infatuation by Nasser-ud-Din Shah and a figure who rose to become a powerful courtier in the last decades of his reign, and was eventually married to one of the Shah's daughters, solidifying his position as part of the Qajar royal family. The central position he occupies in this image, surrounded by high-ranking enslaved servants of the court, attests to his significant status in the Shah's harem from an early age. Yet as the nephew of a woman who was purchased for 6 tomans only 2 decades earlier and was brought into the harem as an enslaved servant, his placement as a focal point in both this image and Nasser-ud-Din Shah's actual harem offers us some insight into the complex nature and social reality of slavery as it was practiced in Iran during this period. This paper takes the late Qajar court and its harem as one historically specific site through which we can examine the complex history of slavery in 19th century Iran and the ways in which hierarchies of race, gender, and sex functioned as constitutive elements within this institution. It's part of a larger project, as I mentioned, that explores the historical and archival traces of enslaved people who lived and labored in the royal Qajar harem during Nasser-ad-Din Shah's reign, in order to examine how these categories produce differences in status and social mobility amongst and between various servants, often through intimate relations and primarily along gendered and racial lines. Part of my larger argument is that although slavery in 19th century Iran was not exclusively a race-based institution, race mattered and racial hierarchies, and more specifically anti-Black sentiments, were prevalent. Indeed, as we will see, race was one of several key factors that governed, but not necessarily blocked, pathways to power and social status among enslaved populations. For today, I'll be zooming in on the lives and afterlives of two particular eunuchs who appear in the introductory paragraph. Sorry, I forgot to switch slides. So this was supposed to come earlier. I'm going to move to here. Aziz Khan and Allah Bahram, whose life trajectories offer us some insight into the racial and gender legacies of late 19th century slavery in Iran. According to Nasser-ad-Din Shah's grandson, there were approximately 90 eunuchs who resided and worked in the Gulistan palace during the Shah's reign. This group was primarily composed of enslaved people who played a particularly crucial role as liminal figures in court and harem life with a unique social position. Like other enslaved people, these subjugated bodies were separated from family and community, trafficked across vast territories, and sold in various slave markets. However, unlike other enslaved populations, eunuchs were made incapable of reproduction through the invasive and often dangerous procedure of castration, preventing them from having future bloodlines. Since they were usually captured at a young age and left with little knowledge of their origins, they were considered kinless and raised, sheltered, fed, and educated inside the palace. Thus, their loyalty to their masters and mistresses was presumed to be absolute. Castration was a brutal act usually performed on male children before they were trafficked and sold, with the goal of desexualizing enslaved male bodies. It also served to give eunuchs privileged access to the most private sphere of the palace, its harem, where they were entrusted with the special duty of protecting and serving the women and educating their children. Trained in a variety of arts and sciences, from reading and writing to horsemanship and music, eunuchs were also assimilated into the cultural and social codes that governed their private and public lives. They in turn transmitted their knowledge and skills to a new generation of household, both royal women and descendants, as well as other enslaved children placed under their tutelage. As mentors, they also forged strong and intimate bonds with royal children, and these relationships, nurtured through trust, loyalty, and mutual dependence, endured well into adulthood, making them confidants of key court and harem figures. This culture of servitude in the elite space of the Qajar harem meant that servants and members of the royal family shared what Anne Stoller and Karen Strassler have termed the emotional economy of the everyday. The various spaces, times, and places within daily life with whom sentiments were displayed, shared, withheld, and demanded. Servants in the Qajar court, who occupied such spaces of everyday life, could leverage these differing relations of proximity to gain intimate knowledge of the private affairs of their masters and mistresses and use them to further their status and place within the harem hierarchy. While such relationships were defined by deeply uneven structures of social status, entitlement, and obligation, there's ample evidence in the sources to suggest that servants used their close bonds to gain various forms of access to wealth and privilege, though this access was indeed negotiated through and limited by the materiality of their gender and racial identities. So for the rest of today's paper, I'm going to focus on these two specific eunuchs in Nasser-ad-Din Shah's court. So a tale of two eunuchs. Aziz Khan and Allah Bahram are two of the high-ranking eunuchs featured in the opening photograph of this essay, who resided in Nasser-ad-Din Shah's palace during the last decade of his reign. Aziz Khan is the white eunuch seated in the front row, third from the right, and Allah Bahram, the black eunuch, almost directly behind him. So this is just a close-up. These two individuals are contemporaries who often appear together in both court photograph and Nasser-ad-Din Shah's writings. While we have little information about their childhood or know how they entered the Qajar palace, during the course of Nasiruddin Shah's reign, they both rose to powerful positions, primarily through their close affiliations with significant Qajar figures, and thus left robust archival traces and afterlife legacies, which offer us historical insight into the possibilities for social mobility open to this class of court constituents. It's important to note from the offset that such prospects were not readily open to most enslaved people in 19th century Iran, the majority of whom led lives far from power and the luxuries associated with the highest ranked servants of the court. And yet, as I will argue, despite the parallels in their historical situation, which led to their exceptional and elite status, race, gender, and sex played a central and defining role in their differing roots and levels of access to power and ultimate life chances. I'm going to begin with the story of Aziz Khan, the 19th century court eunuch who perhaps experienced the greatest ascent to wealth and power and was one of the most visible eunuchs within both visual and textual accounts and documents of Nasiruddin Shah's court and harem. So Aziz Khan was a white eunuch renowned and admired over here for his physical appearance and beauty, belonging to Aisha, one of the Shah's temporary wives or sires. While we know little about his early life, he most likely entered Nasiruddin Shah's court as an enslaved and castrated young boy from the Caucasus region sometime during the first half of the Shah's reign, though he mainly appears in the sources during its last decades. He makes his first appearance in Etemad Saltane's court chronicle on February 5th, 1888. Etemad Saltane writes, quote, Amina Sultan wishes to visit the house of Aziz Khan, one of the Shah's young and beautiful Khoshru eunuchs. Since this eunuch is the object of love, ishq, of the prime minister, he's using the excuse that he's visiting Mirza Hassan, whose house is attached to Aziz Khan's house. Mirza Hassan is deeply confused. Aziz Khan's ascent to power can be attributed to his close and intimate relationship with Amina Sultan, Nasiruddin Shah's last prime minister, who was himself the grandson of a Georgian slave, and whose fondness for the young eunuch is the object of much court gossip. Both local and European sources generally link Aziz Khan to the prime minister with a specific focus on his alluring physical appearance. Amina Sultan's chief rival, the high-ranking court official and pro-Western reformist, Amina Dole, for example, offers a colorful account of the prime minister's love for one of the eunuchs of the harem. In his political diaries, he writes, quote, the prime minister was found with one of the harem eunuchs, whose face was beautiful like the moon, whose hair locks grew like hyacinths, whose cheeks were bright like flowers, and whose chin bore soft and defined lines. He lacked kindness and was salty to his core, though his delicate figure made the condition ripe for intrigue. The poor soul, speaking of Amina Sultan, was captivated and charmed. He could not hide his affections or maintain discretion, since there's no patience in an eager heart. He went from looking to touching. End quote. The suggestion here is, of course, that the prime minister was in fact engaging in an illicit affair with the young eunuch servant, captivated by his physical appearance. Much like descriptions of white enslaved women and concubines from the period who were prized for their beauty, who are part of this larger project, so I follow some of those figures as well. Aziz Khan's features adhered to racialized and gendered beauty standards and were revered with light-skinned complexion and a delicate figure as key markers. The French court physician, Fevrier, gives the following account of him, quote, he's tall and slender, with dainty fingers, a pale complexion, and a white face. Though he is 30 years old, he gives the appearance of a young girl. I've encountered many who have paid him the kind of attention that is usually reserved for the fair sex. It was very awkward for the shy Aziz Khan. He was often mistaken for a woman wearing men's clothes, but he is in reality a eunuch in the royal Andarun, lent out by his mistress to Amina Sultan, end quote. As Fevrier notes, Aziz Khan's slave status meant that he was the property of one of the Shah's wives, Aisha Khanum, but on loan to the prime minister. It was not unusual for enslaved servants of the court to be lent out, gifted, or sold by their masters and mistresses to powerful court figures in order to gain favor. The practice of gifting enslaved young women who were deemed beautiful as concubines to powerful courtly men was particularly common. As I argue in my larger project, being the objects of sexual desire of elite men allowed many white enslaved women access to powerful positions within the court, with some becoming significant wives of the Shah and mothers to royal descendants. In this case, both desirability and access crossed the gender line and were extended to Aziz Khan, who transcended the characterization of eunuchs as asexual bodies, a characterization that was key to enabling them to have access to the harem, situating him as an object of sexual desire, primarily as a result of his physical appearance, which was often described through white and feminized markers. Etemad Saltani increasingly expresses his disapproval of the illicit relationship between the two over the coming months. For example, on September 12, 1888, during Ramadan, he attends an annual religious ceremony at Amina Sultan's private residence. He's displeased that the Prime Minister arrives to the ceremony 2 hours late. Etemad Saltani describes him, quote, with a turban around his neck, being playful and flirting with Aziz Khan in front of 5,000 guests. I was shocked and grieved the state of our government. Note that the relationship between the two is articulated here as a threat or sign of embarrassment to the legitimacy of the governance of the dynasty. As Stoller has warned us, the matters of the intimate are often squarely identified as matters of the state. Much like other high-ranking eunuchs, Aziz Khan was well-educated in court during his youth, even studying photography under Nasser-ad-Din Shah himself. Like most court eunuchs, he was also able to leverage his role as intermediary between the harem and its outside world to gain favor. Sources suggest that Amina Sultan used Aziz Khan as an informant to gain knowledge of the Shah's personal life and private affairs. In fact, Aziz Khan was eventually caught for spying for the prime minister in the harem, and as a result was ejected from Gulistan by Nasser-ad-Din Shah in 1889, losing his position within the court and its harem. His intimate relationship with the prime minister, however, led to him relocating to Amina Sultan's private residence in the aftermath of his eviction, where his power and influence only grew. In fact, much to Etemad Saltani's dismay, and despite having been evicted from the court, Aziz Khan accompanies the prime minister on Nasser-ad-Din Shah's third and final tour of Europe a few months after his eviction. Throughout the trip, Etemad Saltani is consistently irritated by the nature of the prime minister's relationship with Aziz Khan. On one occasion, he describes the two taking a 3-hour-long bath together. At another point, he notes that during the trip, the two sleep together in the same room every night, confusing their Russian hosts. Etemad Saltani describes the behavior of Prime Minister and Aziz Khan, again, as having brought disgrace to Nasser-ad-Din Shah and his entourage amongst their European hosts. Sorry, I keep forgetting to. So here's a picture of them in Europe. So you see that Aziz Khan standing behind Amina Sultan. It's important to note that Aziz Khan's primary point of access to power was his close bond with Amina Sultan, motivated by what seems to be a romantic, if not sexual, relationship, rather than loyalty to his mistress, Aisha Khanum. I argue in my larger project that this particular form of intimacy tended to be deeply connected to a racial logic, where white enslaved bodies were fetishized and made to be objects of romantic and sexual desires in ways which were rarely afforded to Black enslaved bodies. Outside of the court and its harem, and as the prime minister's right-hand man, Aziz Khan was able to consolidate a great deal more power than any high-ranking court eunuch. By 1898, Etemad Saltani describes him as a merciless tyrant when, as a result of a conflict with the eunuch, he's beaten and forced to sell one of his properties to Aziz Khan at a fraction of the cost. By the time of Nasser-ad-Din Shah's assassination the following year in 1896, Aziz Khan had transformed into a powerful figure with considerable influence and wealth. Although Amina Sultan was briefly dismissed as prime minister in the wake of Nasser-ad-Din Shah's assassination and exiled to Rome, he returned to the post in 1898 and served under the title during the reigns of the next two Qajar monarchs. Sources continue to center the intimate relationship between Amin Sultan and Aziz Khan, suggesting their companionship lasted throughout the duration of this period and until the prime minister's own assassination in 1907. For example, Mirza Hussein Khan, a mid-level clerical officer who kept a personal diary, writes of a trip to Qom Amin Sultan takes accompanied by Aziz Khan during Muzaffar ad-Din Shah's reign. The entry is undated, but was most likely written during the exile years. In it, Mirza Hussein Khan describes Aziz Khan as the prime minister's object of desire, taraf-e-mail, and in charge of all his affairs, Hamakarash. Even after Amin Sultan's own passing in 1907, Aziz Khan continued to accumulate wealth and live a lavish life, becoming one of Tehran's most prosperous landowners throughout the reign of the last two Qajar monarchs. Amongst his most fascinating archival traces from this period is a reference to him in a 1909 letter from the Ministry of Finance addressed to the Foreign Affairs Office. Aziz Khan is named as one of several individuals who refused to pay taxes due to their foreign status. The letter states that Aziz Khan seeks exemption from paying taxes to the government based on claims of Russian citizenship. So to explain this, throughout the 19th century, of course, Russia had consolidated power over Central Asia, annexed much of the region from Ottoman Empire and the Qajar dynasty. Thus, the Caucasus was indeed Russian territory by this point, and Aziz Khan's self-identification as a Russian subject, rather than a formerly enslaved Caucasian eunuch, allowed him to claim his background as a source of tax relief, particularly in the aftermath of the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which placed northern Iran, including Tehran and its surrounding areas, under the Russian sphere of influence. Thus, rather than his former slave status being a marker of subjugation, Aziz Khan's cunning diplomacy vis-a-vis the current geopolitical situation allowed him to make a claim about his slave origin as a site of privilege. By the end of his life, Aziz Khan had accumulated a formidable amount of wealth. Court records suggest that his claims to both land and tolls he collected on his properties, many of which were located in the northwestern parts of the country, places such as Zanjan, Ismailabad, and Irajabad, were often contested, with several complaint letters against him corroborating descriptions of him as a tyrant landlord. A detailed outline of his holdings can be found in his will, written in October of 1923 during the last year of Ahmad Shah's reign and right before the fall of the Qajar dynasty. Aside from huge land holdings, the document also lists a large sum of silver and gold coins, jewelry, weapons, equipment such as telescopes purchased during his European tour, musical instruments, including 4 pianos, important paintings and works of calligraphy, and much more. Aziz Khan's afterlife legacy can also in part be traced to sites of knowledge production in modern Tehran. This includes his extensive collection of manuscripts, printed books, and maps, which were donated to the Royal Library and went on to become one of the initial seed collections of the National Library of Iran when it opened in 1937. Income generated from his vast properties also became part of an endowment, which funded one of the largest orphanages in Tehran, Dar al-Yatam Shahpur, housed in his former residence, as well as an art high school for orphan girls, which is still present in downtown Tehran's Enqilab district. The afterlife of Aziz Khan also includes over 2 decades of debates and conflicts over his vast assets between various actors, including named heirs, landowners, members of the parliament, and even the first Pahlavi monarch. Yet few of these records reference Aziz Khan's origin as a young enslaved eunuch and servant of the court. As Bita Baghoulizadeh has argued, unlike Black enslaved and formerly enslaved people, white slaves were able to transcend their slave status and blend into the urban landscape of Tehran in the first decades of the 20th century, making use of their privileged status to create better opportunities and conditions for themselves in freedom. This is one of the many ways in which the materiality of race impacted the life chances of enslaved and formerly enslaved populations in modern Iran. Looking at the story of an elite Black enslaved eunuch, who was Aziz Khan's contemporary, allows us to tease out how racial difference impacted such life chances. So Allah Bahram entered Nasser-ad-Din Shah's court as an enslaved African eunuch and was eventually given to one of the Shah's favorite temporary wives, Amina Aqdas, someone we met earlier in the essay. Herself a formerly enslaved woman who we encountered early in the introduction of this essay, Like Aziz Khan, archival traces of Allah Bahram, though more limited, can be found due to his high-ranking status within the harem, where at the height of his tenure, he was granted the title Amir Divan Khane, Chief Court Eunuch. However, in contrast to portrayals of Aziz Khan, which tended to focus on his physical beauty in descriptive accounts of Allah Bahram, racialized features were a primary focus and often exaggerated in disparaging manners. Consider the following account by the Shah's grandson. Quote, Allah Bahram was amongst the most well-respected eunuchs of the Shah. He had a strange and unusual figure and a terrifying face, large red eyes, hanging cheeks, and large lips with sag, so that when he smiled, his boar-like teeth were visible. He had the attention of the Shah and the respect of the ministers. They all sent their most important requests to the Shah through him and were never disappointed. End quote. Consistent with descriptive accounts of Black female servants, which I examined in the larger project, a derogatory emphasis on physical features and an insistence on comparisons with animals and beasts was naturalized even when describing positive characteristics of Black servants. The Shah's favorite page boy, Amin Abbas's nephew Malijak, offers a similar description of Agha Bahram. Again, quote, Agha Bahram was one of the clever and intelligent eunuchs of the court. He was Black and emaciated, with sunken cheeks and a wide nose. He was unparalleled in his pride and arrogance. When he entered the Shah's home, he first stayed with Johar Aghabashi. When Amir Ardas rose in rank, she requested him from the Shah, and he became her personal eunuch. When she gained more power in the harem, he was named her chief eunuch and took charge of all her affairs. He was trusted, loyal, and lived a respectable life, end quote. Another common feature of these descriptive accounts of enslaved Africans, and particularly enslaved African eunuchs in the Gulistan harem, was this emphasis on their loyalty noted in the quote. As mentioned, the belief stemmed from the idea that since eunuchs were slaves who were purchased at a young age, stripped from all familial ties and cultural allegiances through having been removed from bloodkin, raised and trained in the harem, in Agha Bahram's case by another high-ranking eunuch, Aghabashi, and castrated, they had no choice but to form intimate bonds with their masters and mistresses, which ensured their loyalty, or so it was thought. However, while this quote emphasizes the loyalty and respectability of Agha Bahram and Amin Aqdas's trust in him, sources from the period also reveal him as smart and calculating. Malijak, for example, accuses Agha Bahram of causing a rift between Amin Aqdas and her brother, Agha Mirza Muhammad, Malijak's father, convincing her to dismiss her brother as her trusted confidant and confiscate all his belongings. Her alienation from Mirza Muhammad, whom he had previously been deeply close to, heightened the eunuch's influence over Amin Aqdas. Malijak argues that because Amin Aqdas was herself a former slave woman and thus uneducated, she trusted Agha Bahram completely, was increasingly dependent on him, and was susceptible to his manipulations. Since African eunuchs were often in charge of the education of royal descendants, many were themselves well educated in the court when they were young. In fact, throughout the 19th century, the education of most royal descendants, including Nasiruddin Shah himself and his heirs, was primarily at the hands of various African eunuchs, and often a source of their privilege and power. Perhaps one outcome of Agha Bahram's power and influence over Amin Aqdas can be seen in the fact that when she officially became a temporary wife of Nasiruddin Shah in 1877, solidifying her role in the harem hierarchy, which she herself had entered as a slave woman nearly 20 years earlier, one of her first acts was to request the manumission of the enslaved eunuch, though he continued to work for her as a freed servant well after this date. In a request letter addressed to the cleric Haji Hajjaj Islam, Amin Aqdas asserts that since she is now officially a Sighe and thus the mistress of Agha Bahram, she asks that the cleric grant her wish of offering him his freedom. On August 5th, 1877, Haji Hajjaj Islam grants him manumission and wishes her well. Though within Islamic doctrine, manumitting one's slave is seen as an act of piety, it's perhaps strange that such an act would be amongst Amin Aqdas's earliest assertion of her more formal status in the harem hierarchy. One could read this gesture as signaling the power and influence of Agha Bahram over Amin Aqdas. Agha Bahram's power and influence in the harem also extended beyond Amin Aqdas. In an 1879 booklet from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Finance, which recorded the names, occupations, and titles of court and harem servants, Allah Bahram's name appears with the title Muqarrab al-Khagan, companion of the sovereign, followed by a long list of his subordinates whom he is in charge of. Some sources suggest that he even wielded power and influence over Nasser-ad-Din Shah himself, as well as many important ministers, which he used to convince the Shah and government officials to appoint his allies to high-powered positions in the Qajar bureaucracy. Again, the court chronicler Etemad Saltaneh confirms this characterization of Allah Bahram. For example, on January 13th, 1883, he writes, quote, Allah Bahram, the eunuch who has been working for Amin Aqdas for a short time and who she has trusted completely, has suspiciously managed to accumulate 4,000 tomans of wealth. He was discharged and his account has been closed, end quote. However, only 2 days later, on January 15th, Etemad Saltaneh writes, I saw Allah Bahram, who had been removed, back at the house. A group of ministers and royal descendants had been summoned. Apparently, they had come to vouch for Allah Bahram. The Shah has accepted him back. Clearly, he held sway over these important figures, and they in return maintained his position of power within the harem, much to the dismay of Etemad Saltaneh. Like Aziz Khan, Allah Bahram lived a comfortable life in Tehran even after the disbanding of Nasser-ad-Din Shah's harem upon his assassination in 1896. While archival traces of him from this period are much more scarce than those left by Aziz Khan, he does make a few appearances in the following decades, including as an active participant in the constitutional revolution, which took place between 1905 and 1911. In his memoirs, Yahya Dawlatabadi, a leading constitutionalist, names Allah Bahram as one of a list of people, this is a quote from him, who fought in Muzaffari and Himiyat societies or helped the fighters. These are constitutionalist groups who fought against the Cossack Brigade assault on the parliament during Muhammad Ali Shah's 1908 coup d'etat. While I've yet to locate any specific accounts of Allah Bahram's role and contributions to these organizations, his appearance in Dawlatabadi's list is significant. Again, since court eunuchs like Allah Bahram were well educated and aware of the political affairs of the dynasty due to their proximity to the center of power, it's not hard to believe that they were politically mobilized and active during the constitutional period. And Dawlatabadi's list attests to this fact. He's also not the only eunuch that's mentioned in this list. But the historiography of the constitutional period has yet to account for the role of formerly enslaved people in Iran's reformist modernization project. The last record of Allah Bahram's life I found before his passing is in public archives is a lawsuit filed by him on March 23rd, 1911 against the Qajar court and the Department of Justice, claiming a 2-year delay on salary he's owed. The documents suggest that Allah Bahram was receiving a salary from the court long after his tenure there. By this time, he's residing in a house in Saycheshmeh quarter, a commercial district in Tehran to the northeast of Gulistan Palace. He also owned property in several small villages, mostly on the outskirts of Tehran, including Bahramabad and Musabad, indicating he was an affluent figure for the time period. Like Aziz Khan, Allah Bahram was able to accumulate a significant level of wealth throughout his life and maintain it even after Nasser-ad-Din Shah's assassination and the disbanding of the harem. A list of his endowments produced after his death includes a number of his assets located in the Paminar Grand Bazaar, not far from the eastern gates of the Gulistan Palace. The list includes 13 stores as well as a cistern responsible for storing water for the district. In fact, towards the end of his life, Allah Bahram spent a large sum of his money to erect a building in the area which housed a school and a mosque named after him. The building, which still stands in the old part of the city, is a physical testimony of the life of this once enslaved African who, despite his subjugated position, insisted on leaving a trace of his legacy at the heart of the old city. And yet, despite his affluence and the traces he left behind, Allah Bahram was unable to ever escape his former slave identity fully. While we have little knowledge of his daily life during his last years in Tehran, we can be certain that it was impacted by his racial visibility, which marked him as a product of the institution of slavery in Iran until his death. Again, as Bita Bagholizadeh has effectively argued, by the late 19th century, Blackness was a potent racial marker in Iran and read as the prime characteristic indicating enslavability. She argues that this racist logic was further exacerbated at the turn of the century as blackface theater proliferated in Iran. Perhaps it's not a coincidence that the legacy left behind by both Aziz Khan and Allah Bahram includes sites of knowledge production. As mentioned, being well-educated was a central part of elite court eunuchs' identity and one which they felt pride in. The traces of these two individuals, still present in Tehran today, can be read as an assertion of the legacy of formerly enslaved eunuchs as both educated and educators. They're part of the urban afterlife of enslaved populations in Iran that are rarely examined in the historiography of modern slavery in the region and deserve far more scholarly attention. So as a way to conclude, high-ranking slaves like Aziz Khan and Allah Bahram, who served in Nasruddin Shah's court and harem, were rarely born into their ranks. More often, they entered the court after being captured and sold into the Qajar slave trade. This process included being torn away from families, tribes, and indigenous cultures, enduring bondage, and in the case of eunuchs, imposed bodily mutilation, often a long, harrowing journey where they would also bear witness to many other enslaved individuals who perished en route, a dehumanizing economy, and more. Those who were able to improve their social status and gain access to power in the Qajar court and its intricate harem hierarchy rarely relied on the benevolence of their masters or Islamic doctrine, as some of the old historiography has suggested. Instead, they ascended through complex negotiations of race, genders, and sexuality, and various forms of intimacy that were part of the norms and social structure of such institutions, as well as their own determination, ambition, and cunning negotiations of their circumstances. Furthermore, although slavery in 19th century Iran was not exclusively a race-based institution, race mattered and racial hierarchies, and more specifically anti-Black sentiments, were prevalent. As the case studies in this essay show, race was one of several material factors that determined the pathways to power and social status amongst enslaved populations. So, for example, while Blackness was not an inherent obstacle to wealth accumulation, as the case of Allah Bahram shows, it was often a key determining factor in the kinds of intimate bonds that could be developed between enslaved population and their masters and mistresses. Being the object of sexual desire of powerful men was normalized for Caucasian enslaved women, as well as white eunuchs such as Aziz Khan, and was a common route to powerful positions such as favored wife, concubine, or lover. However, such desires and the forms of intimacy which accompanied them rarely appear to be directed towards enslaved Africans in the court. Thus, while Allah Bahram had to rely on his liminal status, his relationship with his mistress, and his other harem connections to develop and maintain his social position, Aziz Khan's access to power was not only due to his liminal status in terms of both access to the Andarun and Birun, but also through his claim to Caucasian ancestry, as well as his castrated and feminized white body, and its desirability and potential for sexual labor, which allowed him to transcend his position as a servant. Furthermore, regardless of their various degrees of ascent to power, both Aziz Khan and Bahram Agha were a product of Iran's entanglement with a shifting and complex institution of slavery in the 19th century, which cannot and must not be divorced from their life story. This project is an attempt at reconstructing the story of enslaved individuals who, despite systematic violence and concerted efforts towards historical erasure, were able to access better life chances for themselves and leave their traces within both the archives and the urban landscape of Tehran. Such slave narratives are rare within the historiography of modern Iran, but as my research attests, the sources which enable their telling linger within the archives and deserve further scholarly attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions. Sharmin.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much for your rich presentation. I have a question regarding the state of body ownership of the slaves. If I understand correctly, when a slave is bought by the Qajar court, that body, the slave, is belong to the Shah or to the Qajar elites. So how that the state of ownership makes the life of a slave different from the free subject? in the court, because it seems like that these people had a lot of power. They had mobility. They could own things to the level that they could even have impact on the Shah, which brings me to this bigger question that how the slave of the body was different in terms of being owned and tradable compared to a free subject. And if the slave was owned by these authorities, by elites, how about free subjects? I mean, did that body belong to the divine, to the sovereign? How do you understand like these relationships in terms of ownership?
All right. Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm going to give you I'll start with a more specific answer. So what being enslaved versus being freed meant was control over movement. And so there was movement, but that movement was controlled and determined by a master or mistress. So for example, if you were an enslaved figure in the harem and your job was an entertainer, you weren't allowed to perform unless your master or mistress gives you permission. So there's all kinds of regulations over enslaved bodies that happen. And manumission gets rid of some of those regulations in terms of what you can do with your body and what you can't do. So yeah, I mean, at the very basic level, the control over movement, control over, that doesn't mean there wasn't movement of enslaved bodies, but they were controlled and directed by the owner of that enslaved individual. So yeah, that's at a kind of very basic level of defining. So this whole essay came about as a result of me working on the Qajar harem and kind of encountering that this harem was primarily actually occupied by servant classes. They make up the majority of the population within the harem. And so, I had to study what that meant, what servants meant, what slavery meant. And in a lot of the traditional historiography, which much newer work is moving away from, there's this assumption that, let's compare slavery with the Atlantic version of it. It's not as bad. They have so much freedom. They can do so much. And so, we shouldn't even call it slavery. So some people argue, it should be called servitude, not slavery. They actually have these powerful positions. And of course, it's a problematic take because this larger essay also traces the history of the slave trade and the way these bodies were moved into Iran, which is a really important, significant moment of the history of slavery that we often don't talk about when we talk about them as elite servants in the court. So less in this paper, but in the larger paper, I actually do focus a lot on the actual trade and the movement of these bodies. So on this other level, on the bigger level, the stripping of these bodies from their indigenous communities and territories, often at a young age. They're traveling into parts of Iran throughout the 19th century. I mean, it also slavery predates, but specifically African slavery becomes much more popular in Iran in the 19th century, in the later part of the 19th century. So, in all of these ways, the institution of slavery is really important to study as significant and important identity marker of these individuals. And the distinction between free individuals and enslaved individuals, even free servants and enslaved servants, is an important one here.
Thank you.
So let's go to Milad and then Sharmin and then Nabi. Yeah. Okay. You don't have to. Why don't you all ask your question and then maybe you can sort of offer sort of a all-encompassing answer to all those questions.
I'm going to have one answer for all the questions that come up.
Zen word that answers like yes.
I guess one part of my question is sort of follows up, and this question of defining slavery and freedom in relationship to movement. I think so. I guess I don't know what those who. Presumably the Qajar court or the elite could pick up whoever they wanted on the street and limit their movement. And that could also then be, there wasn't a social mechanisms, legal mechanisms to limit that at the time, right? So sovereign could pick anybody who would do that. So what's interesting about what you're saying is that these sort of geopolitical slave trade, which makes, to me, slavery a political category as opposed to a social category in this moment. And that's, I think, an interesting distinction to think about as a geopolitical marker. But I guess
I mean, just to chat, I think it's both. I think it's both political and social.
Okay, sure. My question is about this moment in your talk when you refer to materiality of gender and race. How do we discern the materiality of gender and race without enacting heteronormative gender binaries or racial ideology? Is it possible to take black and white outside of discursive frameworks that make them legible? I guess I don't really know what work materiality is doing, or the eunuchs. Like that is Qajar would be such a reproduction of heteronormative gender binaries, which would be erasure of all other kinds of bodies that would not be within this space. So I guess the materiality confuses me, and I was wondering if you could.
I guess. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Ooh. Okay.
We can continue that conversation later too. But let's hear the questions, and maybe others can think about these questions, and then we have a conversation later because we are running out of time. Sharing, and then David and Shir.
Part of my question was partly answered already, but I'm just wondering, this project essentially really captures the intersection of Iranian slave system, essentially at the intersection of Islamic slavery system with its social mobility and the Western racial categories. Do we see, is this transition, does it take place mostly in the 19th century, where it becomes, we see a differentiation in eunuch or slave categories between Allah Bahram and Aziz Khan. Aziz Khan. Does this take place in the 19th century, or do we see more older developments prior to the 19th century? Also, what were inter-harem racial relations? So did they also have the same racial views towards one another? Or?
Okay, wait, I don't know how to. Okay, let me just write.
Yeah.
We might have to do some of this over lunch, but I will do my best.
Mine can definitely be over lunch, but my question is about whether race is a juridical category or a phenomenological category. So whiteness as a concept is from the Virginia colonies in like 1680, 1690. And by the time you get to Linda Alcock being able to say that whiteness is a visible identity, she's not saying that it's merely phenomenological. She's saying that that moment in which the juridical category is articulated is now so normalized in society that now whiteness is a visible identity. In this context, right, we're looking at a time where it seems to me like whiteness is being retrojected onto a moment in which it is still very much in formation. And so I wonder if, so the stakes to me are high for understanding whiteness as a juridical category and something that is like properly material. And here it seems that it's like this person's white. And the way that makes sense to me is because I am from a world in which whiteness is a visible identity given this particular history. So to what extent is this appealing rhetorically to me, right? To us who live in the wake of a white supremacist history? And how much is that, it seems to me, is that history mediating your interpretation, your phenomenology of your method, or phenomenological method? And so phenomenological, that's like kind of the sort of question I have. And so, I mean, it's a big question, but so what's the relationship between the juridical and the phenomenological in your understanding of the category of whiteness within this context?
Shaker, you have the last word.
Okay. Thanks so much for your wonderful talk. I'm wondering if you engage with how court politics plays into the sources, especially with people like Edmond Mossavar-Rahmani and his animosity with Amin Sultan.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of those court politics affects the physical descriptions and the descriptions of intelligence of specifically the eunuchs. And if you could actually give us some examples from that.
Yeah.
So we are out of time. You can say thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll discuss over lunch.
Yeah, I was curious about the question because the questions are also wonderful because it forces all of us to think about these categories and the narrative at the same time.
Yeah.
And we can continue that conversation later. Thank you so much, and please, I'm sorry about this conflict in time. And next week, I'm sorry.
I'm just laughing at the 4 questions in a row.
So next week,
Thank you.
12:15, we'll going to be inside, and then lunch hopefully will be here. Apparently, the lunch was taken to the other location today. I apologize. It's outside that? Okay, so on your way out, make sure that you grab your lunch. And thank you again. Thank you, Leila.